The year was 1943. Across Europe, the thunder of war had become the background rhythm of life. The drone of aircraft, the rumble of tanks, the whistle of shells cutting to the cold air. Deep inside Berlin, far from the front lines, another battle was taking place. One not of guns or steel, but of numbers, charts, and quiet realizations that would shake even the most loyal minds of the Reich. In a dimly lit room beneath the Ministry of Armaments, a handful of analysts, mathematicians, logisticians, and engineers gathered around long tables strewn with captured Allied documents. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Papers rustled. The low hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the scratch of pencils. These men, working under orders from the German High Command, were tasked with a monumental project: to study the industrial and logistical capacity of the United States, now fully engaged in the war. The charts had come from captured supply convoys, intercepted shipping manifests, and fragments of intelligence gathered through spies, radio intercepts, and recovered cargo. On their surfaces, they appeared routine, schedules, production reports, stockpile summaries. But when laid side by side, the pattern they revealed was staggering. Faint typing echoed to the corridors as distant sirens wailed across the Berlin night. They began by calculating tonnage, the steel, aluminum, and fuel reserves of the United States as of late 1942. Within weeks, the numbers grew unreal. One analyst, a young engineer named Dieter Hoffmann, drew a red line on the map stretching from Detroit to Los Angeles. Beneath it, he scribbled in pencil, "Uninterrupted supply chain, condensed factory." "If this is correct," he said quietly, "even if half of it is propaganda, they can replace everything we destroy." At first, there was disbelief. Germany's war machine had been built on precision, efficiency, and discipline. It was the most advanced in Europe. Yet here were records showing American factories producing tanks, planes, and ammunition in quantities that defied comprehension. A single American automobile plant was turning out more engines per month than some entire German sectors. What began as a technical exercise soon turned into an existential reckoning. Hoffmann and his superior, Colonel Hans Reinhardt, presented their first summary to the Oberkommando in early February 1943. The report was cautious, restrained in tone, but the implications were devastating. The United States, protected by oceans, powered by near-limitless resources, and driven by an industrial base untouched by war, could outproduce Germany tenfold in nearly every measurable category. In the smoky Berlin room, silence followed the presentation. One general laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Numbers," he muttered, "always numbers. But wars are not won on paper." Reinhardt's voice remained calm. "With respect, Her General, this paper represents steel, oil, men. Without it, no army moves." The general said nothing. Across 1943, as the Allies gained ground in North Africa and the Eastern Front bled in snow and fire, Reinhardt's team kept studying. They charted the U.S. shipbuilding rates, Liberty ships rolling off assembly lines every few days. They tracked the expansion of airfields across Britain. They compared oil production. The United States refining more in a week than Germany could in a month, even with synthetic fuel plants running at full capacity. Every chart led to the same conclusion. The war Germany believed it could still win was, mathematically, already lost. Pencil scratching mixed with the distant moan of air raid alarms. Within the Reich, such words were dangerous. Reports had to be phrased carefully. Numbers could be shown, but never interpreted in a way that questioned the Führer's vision. Reinhardt knew this. His memos became cautious, coded. "Our industrial capacity will face increasing strain under prolonged engagement," he wrote, bureaucratic language masking a more brutal truth. "We cannot keep up." Still, the work continued. By summer, Hoffmann and his team acquired a full set of captured American logistical charts from North Africa, detailed breakdowns of supply routes, shipping schedules, and maintenance cycles. They pored over them night after night. What stunned them most wasn't just the volume of supplies. It was the system. Every bullet, every can of fuel, every spare part had a destination, a contingency, a replacement cycle. Nothing was left to improvisation. They planned for losses before they happened, one analyst murmured. Hoffmann nodded. "They think in redundancies. We think in perfection." In that contrast lay the fundamental difference between the two powers. Germany sought the perfect, to engineer every machine, every plan, to its ideal limit. The United States sought to multiply, to create systems that could sustain chaos, absorb loss, and keep moving forward. By the autumn of 1943, the analysts were no longer arguing about data. They were wrestling with disbelief. The United States had launched a shipbuilding program so vast that the tonnage of new vessels exceeded all those sunk by German U-boats. It was a logistical resurrection the Reich's best minds could barely fathom. Ship horns sounded in the distance of their memories as typewriters clattered. Reports of American bombers over Hamburg and Bremen filled the airwaves, and Hoffman realized something chilling. For every plane shot down, America built 2 more before dawn. We can win battles, he whispered to himself, but not the arithmetic. By December, the walls of the Berlin Analysis office were lined with maps and graphs, colored pins marking production sites, supply routes, and projected growth curves. The picture was unmistakable. The United States was not simply fighting a war. It was constructing an engine of total war, a machine of scale and endurance that no European power could match. The analysts knew that no amount of tactical brilliance or secret weapons could overturn those curves. They watched as their data became prophecy, the tide of material power rising inexorably westward. But in the corridors of power, truth was not welcome. Reinhardt's final comprehensive report, thick-bound and stamped Guillaume, was submitted in January 1944. The conclusion was understated, almost poetic in its restraint. The enemy's productive capacity exceeds our capacity to destroy it. The report was never circulated beyond the ministry. The sound of documents stamping and pages turning echoed faintly. In a war driven by ideology, numbers could be treason. Yet in those underground rooms, amid the hum of generators and the crackle of the radio, a handful of German analysts had already glimpsed the inevitable. They had studied the captured charts, run the equations, followed the logic to its grim end. And in that quiet reckoning, they understood, not through emotion but through mathematics, that Germany could never win. A low drone faded into silence, the hum of an engine echoing into the distance. What began as analysis had become prophecy. And as 1944 dawned, the men who had seen the truth were left with only questions: how long and how terrible the end would be. Winter tightened its grip on Europe as 1944 began, snow falling over cities scarred by fire and steel. The war that had once promised triumph now felt endless, its echo reaching even the deepest corridors of Berlin. Inside the armaments ministry, the analyst's office had grown colder, the air heavy with exhaustion and resignation. The men still gathered each morning, bringing folders under their arms, scarves wrapped tight against a freezing wind that swept through the broken windows. The lights flickered, powered by generators that hummed faintly below ground. Around them, the Empire's machinery of war creaked and faltered. Reinhardt stood at the end of the long table, his posture still erect but his eyes darker than before. The fresh reports in the front lay in front of him, the numbers smudged with soot and dust. Fuel production had dropped by 1/3. Rail networks were failing under the relentless bombings. Airfields were being rebuilt as fast as they were destroyed. Hoffman watched his superior in silence, feeling the weight of the numbers that no speech could erase. Each line on their graphs was a slow heartbeat, weakening with every month that passed. "It's not a front anymore," Hoffman said quietly, tapping the edge of a report. "It's the whole structure. It's collapsing from within." Reinhardt gave a small nod, but said nothing. The others pretended not to hear. Outside the ministry, Berlin was already changing. Air raid sirens cried each night. Fires painted the horizon. Yet even through the chaos, orders came down from above demanding new projections, new estimates of victory. The analysts gave them what they wanted: optimistic curves, cautious phrases, numbers that had the truth inside neutral language. Production stabilizing, one report read. Synthetic fuel output improving. They all knew it was a lie. Every figure they forged bought only time. One afternoon, a courier arrived with fresh intelligence, captured American and British logistical data from North Africa and Sicily. The men gathered around the documents, unfolding maps that showed the Allied supply network spreading like veins across the Mediterranean. Each line represented movement, food, fuel, ammunition replacements, an entire mechanical ecosystem in motion. They treat supply as life itself, Hoffman murmured. We treat it as background. He traced a line from Algiers to Naples with the tip of his pencil. This is not just transport. It's strategy. Reinhardt stared at the map and exhaled. They fight with factories. We fight with faith. By spring, the evidence was undeniable. Allied air power was growing beyond calculation. Trains carrying oil or munitions rarely reached their destinations. The Reich's once vaunted precision was dissolving under the weight of endless bombardment. Every factory that fell meant another gap that could never be filled. Hoffman's younger colleague, a thin man named Keller, tried to make sense of the imbalance by drawing two curves on a wall. Germany's output sinking downward, America's climbing like a mountain. If the war lasted 2 more years, he said, we wouldn't even exist on this chart. Reinhardt looked at the wall, then back at the men. It will last longer, he replied. By June, their predictions became reality. The invasion of Normandy transformed the war into something vast and irreversible. News reached them in fragments, reports from the Western Front, radio intercepts, intercepted Allied communiques. The analysts pieced it together in silence, their faces pale under the harsh light. Allied convoys poured into France, supplying divisions faster than German logistics could even record. In 1 week, they landed more material than Germany could produce in a month. This isn't war, Hoffman whispered. It's industry unleashed. Reinhardt pressed his hand against his temple, and we built our faith on scarcity. As the summer wore on, air raids grew constant. The analyst's office shuddered at night under the weight of bombs. Dust fell from the ceiling, the lamps swinging on their cords. Yet they kept working, as though routine itself could shield them from collapse. They no longer filed reports to the ministry. Those had stopped being read. Their work had become a record for themselves, a way to measure the disintegration of everything they had once believed in. Hoffman began writing brief reflections in the margins of his charts. A nation cannot win a war it cannot measure. Belief cannot replace production. The words felt treasonous, but they were truer than any speech on the radio. By late summer, the city itself seemed to whisper resignation. The trains that once carried troops now carried the wounded and the displaced. Children wandered through rubble collecting bits of twisted metal. The factories that still operated did so by candlelight, guarded by men who no longer believed in victory. Inside the ministry, Reinhardt gathered his small team and spoke softly, almost like a teacher at the end of a long lesson. You will keep the records, he said. Not for command, not for propaganda, for memory. Someone will have to understand how this happened. Hoffman met his eyes. They won't believe it, he said. They'll say it was betrayal. Reinhardt nodded. Then let them. Truth outlives belief. Autumn brought more silence than sound. The front was shrinking toward the borders. Reports came in slower now, often incomplete, often contradictory. But the pattern was still clear. American factories were now producing more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could hope to shoot down, more tanks than the Reich could field, more food than Europe could harvest. The arithmetic of defeat had completed itself. There was nothing left to interpret. On one of the last quiet evenings of the year, Hoffman stood alone in the analysis room. The others had gone home, the lights dimmed, the windows blacked out. The maps still hung on the walls, covered in pins and ink. But to him, they no longer looked like data. They looked like gravestones. He ran his hand across one, tracing the lines of supply and production that stretched across the Atlantic. Outside, faintly, the low wail of sirens began again. He did not move. In the weeks that followed, their work all but stopped. The ministry no longer sent orders. The charts were left unfinished, the pencils dulled to stubs. But their meaning remained. The analysts had long since seen what the rest of the Reich refused to. That wars would be decided by unseen forces, by factories' fuel and the slow, relentless rhythm of logistics. They had watched the defeat take shape not on the battlefield, but in the steady tilt of numbers across their charts. The snow returned in December, quieting the ruined city. Somewhere above the clouds, the bombers passed again unseen, their engines humming like fate. Hoffman sat at his desk, hands folded, eyes closed. "It's all here," he whispered to himself. "The whole story, written in the margins." He did not mean the documents or the maps. He meant the silence between them, the unspoken certainty that Germany, for all its might, had already been defeated long before the world knew it. By the first month of 1945, Berlin was a city of ghosts. Streets that once echoed with the cadence of boots and the roll of engines now lay broken beneath layers of ash and snow. The war had come home. Windows were boarded, doors barricaded, and the air carried the smell of smoke and fatigue. In the Ministry of Armaments, the Analysts' office was nearly deserted. The once orderly tables were scattered with half-burned papers, faded charts, and notebooks bound together with string. The humming lights had gone dark weeks earlier. Only candles and oil lamps now lit the narrow corridors. What had once been a place of calculation had become a kind of tomb, a sanctuary for those who still measured what could no longer be changed. Hoffman arrived each morning through streets filled with refugees and soldiers retreating from the east. The city's rhythm had slowed to survival. His boots left prints in the dust that never stayed long before being covered again by debris. Inside the ministry, he found Keller still working, wrapped in a coat, his hands shaking from the cold. They spoke little. The chart spoke for them. "Another field army gone," Keller murmured one day, his voice dry. "They don't even report the numbers anymore." Hoffman nodded. He didn't ask for details. The outcome was already clear. Their latest calculations showed not only defeat, but disintegration. No longer lines or ratios, only collapse. Fuel reserves had vanished. Rail lines were cut. Even if factories could produce, nothing could reach the front. Reinhardt still came when he could, though his hair had turned gray, his uniform threadbare. He no longer spoke of reports or directives. Instead, he asked for quiet, for patience, for dignity in their final work. "History will not ask what we believed," he said once. "It will ask what we knew." So they kept writing, preserving fragments, production tallies, fuel data, logistics curves, all useless now, yet sacred in their honesty. Each night, the building shook as bombs fell closer. The sound of the sirens no longer stirred panic. It had become a routine rhythm, a second heartbeat to the city's slow death. By March, their windows trembled with every distant explosion. Through the cracks in the blacked-out glass, they could sometimes see the sky glow red from the eastern horizon. The Soviets were coming. Rumors spread faster than facts. Mass evacuations, lost divisions, officers disappearing without trace. Some of the younger clerks fled. Others stayed, either out of duty or because there was nowhere left to go. Hoffman stayed because he could not leave the data unfinished. "We started it," he said to Keller. "We must end it." In the final weeks, the ministry became a shelter. Soldiers came to sleep in the hallways. Civilians sought warmth in the stairwells. Paper was burned for heat. Reinhardt, gaunt and pale, continued to record, his handwriting slow and deliberate even as his fingers trembled. "The last entries," he murmured one night, "must still be true." Outside, artillery rolled like distant thunder, the sound of front line that no longer had a name. Then came April, the war's final month. Berlin was surrounded. Every morning began with shell fire. Every night ended in silence. The office was half in ruins now. One wall had collapsed from a nearby blast. The air was filled with dust and the faint smell of oil. Hoffman worked at a single surviving desk, surrounded by piles of paper. The maps were tattered, some burned at the edges, but he still traced their lines with pencil, marking what was left of the Reich supply routes. Thin, broken arteries feeding nothing. Keller slept in a chair nearby, too weak to stand for long. They had run out of food 2 days before. On the night of April 20th, Hoffman wrote one final line in the margins of his chart. "The equation is complete." Then he set down the pencil. The building shook again, and a gust of wind blew out the lamp. He sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the distant guns. In that moment, he thought of the first day he had seen the captured American charts, years ago, in a clean, bright room filled with energy and confidence. The realization came quietly, almost tenderly, that the truth had been known since then. The war had already been decided not by armies, but by arithmetic, and the rest had been the slow unfolding of inevitability. When the shells finally reached the city center, the ministry was hit. The ceiling collapsed in the western wing. Keller was gone by morning, buried beneath the rubble. Hoffman and Reinhardt survived in the basement, surrounded by the remnants of their work. Burned paper, shattered glass, fragments of maps that no longer meant anything. Reinhardt could barely speak. "All these numbers," he whispered. "All this truth, and no one left to read it." Hoffman looked around at the wreckage, the dim light flickering across the concrete walls. "Maybe that's not what matters," he said softly. "We saw it. That's enough." Days later, Soviet soldiers entered the building. They found a handful of survivors among the ruins. One of them, a young lieutenant, searched the debris and uncovered a box of charred documents, pages filled with columns of figures, supply charts, and handwritten notes. He glanced at them without understanding, folded them into his coat, and left. Somewhere in the great archives of a new world, those papers would rest unread for decades. Berlin fell in silence. Smoke drifted over the spree, carrying the scent of oil, dust, and ash. The war that had begun in certainty ended in quiet calculation. Hoffman walked once more through the empty halls, the crunch of glass under his boots echoing through the void. He paused at the shattered window and looked out over the city. For the first time, there was no sound of engines, no orders, no reports, only the low hum of wind through ruins. He thought of the numbers, the charts, the endless columns that had foretold this end, and he felt no bitterness, only a strange calm. The world had become what the data had promised. The factories across the ocean still roared, untouched. The machine of production still moved, unstoppable. Somewhere, ships unloaded cargo onto docks that gleamed under foreign sunlight. Somewhere, assembly lines still turned, precise and tireless. Here, there was only stillness. Hoffman closed his eyes and whispered. It was never faith. It was always arithmetic. The words vanished into the dust-filled air. When morning came, the city was quiet. The guns had stopped. The ministry stood hollow, its walls scorched, its records scattered. But within those ruins lay the remains of an understanding that few had ever reached, a vision of the war stripped of ideology, of passion, of illusion. The analysts had looked into the machinery of the modern world and seen its secret. That power, in the end, belonged not to those who fought hardest, but to those who could build forever. The summer of 1945 arrived slowly, like a ghost rising from the ashes. The war had ended, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that came before. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of stone and smoke, a carcass of empire picked apart by time and victors. The flags had changed, the uniforms too, but the ruins remained the same. In one of those ruins, the former Ministry of Armaments, dust drifted through the open rafters like snow. Somewhere beneath the rubble, a door creaked open. Dieter Hoffmann stepped inside, older, thinner, dressed in worn civilian clothes. His eyes moved across the empty room where the analyst tables once stood. The walls still bore the marks of pins and maps, faint outlines of charts that had long since burned away. He stood there for a long moment, the sound of distant hammers echoing through the city as the victors began to rebuild what had been destroyed. He found a chair upright near the wall, brushed the dust off, and sat. From his coat pocket, he drew a small notebook, brittle, pages yellow from time and smoke. Inside were the last surviving fragments of their work, the equations and notes they had hidden before the final bombardment. His handwriting was steady, the words simple. The capacity to fight is the capacity to make. He read it aloud once, softly, as if speaking to ghosts. Outside, the streets were filled with Allied trucks and uniforms of every color. Children chased after soldiers for candy. Posters promised food and freedom. The Reich that had promised eternity was gone, replaced by something uncertain but alive. The city was beginning again. Yet for Hoffman, there was no beginning, only understanding. The numbers had come true exactly as they had predicted. The limitless energy of the American factories, the unbroken lines of supply, the patience of mass production, all had reshaped the world. The war, he realized, had been only the first act of a new era, one where wars would not be fought by armies alone, but by economies by capacity, by systems too vast for any one man to grasp. He wandered the ruins in silence. Where the ministry's great map once hung, there was now a gaping hole open to the sunlight. Dust glittered in the air. He thought of Reinhardt, of Keller, of the others who believed that truth, once found, could save them. But truth had no power in a world built on obedience. Still, their work had not been in vain. They had seen the mechanism beneath the myth, the machine that had turned the tide long before the front collapsed. Hoffman whispered their names one by one into the empty air, as though the walls might remember. Later that evening, he walked toward the river. The bridges were half rebuilt, the water thick with debris. But the city had begun to move again. Small boats carrying supplies, cranes lifting twisted steel. Across the river, he could see the new banners of occupation fluttering in the breeze. He paused, staring at them, not with resentment but with weary awe. He knew what they meant. An order built on production, a civilization sustained by scale. The empire of factories had won, and it would not fall easily. He took a piece of charcoal from his pocket and wrote one last note in his book. In the end, no army lost. Only mathematics prevailed. Then he closed the cover and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. He walked until night fell, the city glowing faintly under foreign lights. The sound of hammers echoed in the distance, rhythmic and endless, the pulse of reconstruction. In a small cafe reopened under Allied supervision, Hoffman sat at a wooden table and listened to a hum of conversation around him. New languages, new currencies, new laws. The waitress poured him coffee from a tin kettle. He thanked her quietly. She smiled but did not recognize the exhaustion behind his voice. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine that none of it had happened, that the world had not torn itself apart over illusions of power. But then he looked at the street outside, at the convoys of trucks bearing fuel and grain, and he knew that the cycle had only changed shape. As night deepened, he opened his notebook again and began to write, not statistics this time, but memory, about Reinhardt, who believed truth could survive war, about Keller, who drew the curves that foretold collapse, about the moment when they first understood that victory and defeat were merely points on a graph of production. He wrote until the words blurred, until the candle burned low. When he finished, he tore out the last page and placed it on the table. The war was lost the day we learned to count. He left it there and stepped outside. The air was cool, the city breathing again. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played music from a new world. The sound drifted through the broken streets, light and unburdened. Hoffman walked slowly through the ruins until he reached the same corner where the ministry once stood. He looked up at the sky, where the clouds glowed faintly from the light of the occupying camps. For a moment, he thought of the first day, years ago, when the charts had arrived, the clean lines, the printed tables, the perfect order of numbers. He smiled faintly. Somewhere far away, across the ocean, the factories still hummed, producing the future. He could almost hear them, the rhythm of engines, the roll of machines, the whisper of endless creation. The sound was steady, eternal. He listened for a while, then turned away, disappearing into the quiet streets of the city that no longer belonged to him. Above the ruins, the night wind carried the faint smell of smoke and spring rain. The war was over, but its equation endured. Power had changed hands, but the arithmetic of the modern world remained. And as the last echo of footsteps faded into silence, the city, broken yet alive, began again, its destiny already written, not in blood or glory, but in the unending logic of numbers.